The phone call came on a Tuesday morning, but I let it ring until it stopped. I knew who it was before I checked the caller ID. Family has a way of finding you when you least want to be found, slipping through the cracks of the life you've built to remind you of the person you used to be. My name is Margaret, and at 64, I've built an empire that spans 3 states. The marble floors of my penthouse reflect the morning light like scattered diamonds, and my coffee costs more than most people spend on groceries in a week. But wealth couldn't silence the trembling in my hands when my youngest sister's voice reached through the answering machine, whispering words I'd dreaded for decades. Papa was dying. I set down my hands and stared out at the city skyline, watching tiny figures move like ants 40 stories below. They had no idea that the woman who owned half their apartment buildings once wore the same dress 3 days straight because it was the only clean thing she had. The memories came anyway, sliding through my carefully constructed walls like smoke under a door. 16 years old, standing barefoot on our cracked linoleum floor, while Papa counted crumpled bills with fingers that shook from more than just desperation. Mama had been dead for 2 years by then, her absence as heavy as the unpaid bills that covered our kitchen table like fallen leaves. My 3 older sisters had learned to make themselves invisible when Papa's gambling friends came around, disappearing into bedrooms or slipping out back doors like ghosts who'd learned that survival meant becoming nothing at all. But I was still young enough to believe that fathers protected their daughters, still naive enough to think that love meant safety. I was so terribly wrong. The first time Papa told me to put on Mama's old blue dress and go with the man at the door, I thought I misunderstood. The dress hung loose on my 16-year-old frame. The fabric faded from countless washings until the color matched my mother's eyes in the last photograph we had of her. The man waiting in our doorway had silver hair and kind eyes, and he spoke to Papa in hushed tones while sliding an envelope across our scratched kitchen table. Papa's debt was growing faster than weeds after rain, choking out every bit of hope our family had left. My sisters had already found ways to disappear. Jobs, boyfriends, anything that kept them away from the house where shame had taken up residence like an unwelcome relative who'd never leave. But at 16, I had nowhere to go and no one to catch me when I fell. But I had nowhere to go, and Papa's eyes had already moved past me to count his temporary salvation. That first night changed everything, though I couldn't name what was happening to me then. The shame sat heavy in my chest, a stone that grew larger each day until breathing became a conscious effort. I learned to walk quietly through our house, to avoid looking at myself in mirrors, to pretend that the girl in the blue dress was someone else entirely. Papa stopped looking me in the eye after that first envelope, and my sisters pretended not to notice when I came home with money for groceries, or when strange men picked me up in expensive cars that smelled like leather and cologne and other people's secrets. For 2 years, I lived in a world where my body wasn't my own, and my voice didn't matter. The nights blurred together like watercolors in the rain, hotel rooms that smelled of leather and regret, old hands that paid Papa's debts $1 at a time, and the weight of silence that pressed against my ribs until I forgot how to breathe normally. I learned to float outside myself during those moments, to count ceiling tiles and memorize wallpaper patterns until the men finished whatever they needed from me. My sisters married quickly and moved away, as if distance could wash the stain of our family's shame from their skin. They sent Christmas cards but never visited, as if our house had become contaminated with something that might spread to their new lives. But then Harold appeared like an answer to prayers I'd been too afraid to speak. I met him on an October evening when the leaves were turning gold and the air carried promises of winter. The hotel room was the same as all the others: beige walls, scratchy carpet, curtains that blocked out the world beyond. But Harold was different from the beginning, gentle in a way that startled me, with hands that trembled when he touched my face as if I might break beneath his fingers. At 73, Harold had buried 2 wives and spent his loneliness in the same dark places where Papa sent me. But instead of taking what he'd paid for, Harold sat across from me in that sterile hotel room and asked my name. Not the name Papa told me to use, not the fake persona I'd learned to inhabit. My real name spoken like it mattered. That question broke something open inside my chest, and I cried for the first time in 2 years. The tears came like a dam bursting, washing away months of numbness until I remembered what it felt like to exist inside my own skin. Harold handed me his handkerchief and waited until my breathing slowed. Then he asked if I wanted to leave with him. Not for an hour or a night, but for good, forever. Away from Papa and the blue dress and the endless parade of men who saw me as something to be purchased. I nodded before I could stop myself, afraid that speaking might make the offer disappear. Harold paid Papa a sum that cleared every debt and added enough extra to keep him comfortable for years. I watched through our kitchen window as Harold counted out more money than I'd ever seen, bills laid out on our table like green promises of a different life. Papa's hands shook as he signed papers. I couldn't read, and for the first time since Mama died, he looked ashamed of what he'd become. Then Harold took me to his sprawling house in the hills, where the rooms smelled like beeswax and lavender instead of desperation. He gave me my own bedroom with a lock on the inside of the door, and he never asked for anything except my company at dinner and someone to share his quiet evenings. Slowly, carefully, I learned to trust again. Harold taught me to read contracts and balance ledgers, to speak with confidence in boardrooms where my voice had never been welcome. He enrolled me in business classes and hired tutors to fill the gaps in my education. He introduced me as his companion, never as property, and he defended my intelligence to men who assumed I was decoration for his arm. When people whispered about our age difference, Harold would smile and say that wisdom had no timeline. When they questioned my place in his business meetings, he'd explain that I had insights they lacked. He built my confidence the same way he built his buildings, one solid foundation stone at a time. We had 26 months together before his heart gave out on a peaceful Sunday morning. I found him in his garden, kneeling among the roses he'd planted for his first wife, his face peaceful in a way that told me he'd left without pain. His lawyers had prepared everything in advance, papers that made me sole heir to his construction business, his real estate holdings, and enough money to ensure I'd never be powerless again. Harold left me a letter explaining that he'd seen too much of his own lost daughter in my frightened eyes that first night, and he couldn't bear the thought of another man's child suffering when he had the power to change her life. He'd spent 2 years teaching me to be strong because he knew I'd need that strength to survive in a world that hadn't been kind to either of us. I threw myself into Harold's companies with the fury of someone who'd nearly drowned and finally learned to swim. Every contract I negotiated was a declaration of independence from the girl who'd once worn her dead mother's dress to survive. Every building I bought was another step away from the 16-year-old who'd learned to float outside her own body. Every decision I made was proof that I'd become someone Papa could never sell again. Within 5 years, I doubled Harold's investments and expanded into 3 new markets. Within 10 years, I owned more property than any woman in the state. Within 20 years, my name appeared on buildings and scholarships and charity foundations that helped girls like the one I used to be. My sisters called occasionally, asking for help with down payments and wedding expenses and children's college funds. I gave generously, remembering how they disappeared when I needed them most, but choosing forgiveness over bitterness. They deserved better than what Papa had offered any of us, and I had enough money to ensure their children would never know the kind of desperation that had shaped our family. But Papa himself was an entirely different story. I cut him from my life like dead wood from a healthy tree, severing the connection with the precision of someone who'd learned that survival sometimes required amputation. When he tried to visit my office, I had security escort him out with instructions never to let him pass the lobby again. When he sent letters, I burned them without reading past his name in the return address. When he called, I hung up before he could say my name, before his voice could carry me back to that kitchen where he'd counted bills while I'd worn Mama's dress. The man who'd sold his youngest daughter to pay his debts had lost the right to call me family, the moment he'd chosen gambling over protecting me. My sisters stopped mentioning him after a while, understanding that forgiveness had limits even for someone who could afford to be generous. They'd learned not to bring him to family gatherings or to pass along his messages about wanting to see me. They understood that some bridges, once burned, could never be rebuilt. For 45 years, I built a life where Papa's choices couldn't touch me. I became the woman Harold had seen hiding inside that broken teenager. Strong, decisive, protective of others who reminded me of my younger self. I funded scholarships for girls aging out of foster care. I invested in safe houses for women escaping difficult situations. I made sure my money did good in the world, creating options for people who had none. And then came yesterday's phone call, shattering the peace I'd constructed like a stone through glass. My sister Clara's voice had been careful, respectful of boundaries I'd maintained for decades. Papa was in hospice care, she explained, his liver finally paying the price for a lifetime of bad choices that had started with gambling and ended with drinking away the guilt of what he'd done to his youngest daughter. He was asking for me, she said, asking for forgiveness, asking for a chance to see the successful woman his daughter had become before his time ran out. I listened to her entire message twice, studying the tremor in her voice that suggested she knew what she was asking of me. Then I deleted it and poured myself a glass of wine that cost more than Papa had ever won in a single night of cards. This morning brought the second call, the one I'd answered out of habit before recognizing her number. Clara's words were more urgent now. Papa might have hours, not days. He was lucid enough to understand what was happening, and he kept repeating my name like a prayer. He'd been sober for 3 years, she added desperately, as if that somehow erased the damage he'd done when addiction controlled his choices, and I'd been the price he'd paid for temporary relief. I stood in my kitchen, surrounded by the luxury Harold's love had provided, and considered the weight of mercy. Some women might have felt obligated to visit, to offer deathbed forgiveness for the sake of their own peace. Others might have reasoned that Papa's final years of sobriety proved he'd changed, that the man dying alone had somehow become different from the one who'd sold me to strangers. But I thought of that 16-year-old girl in the blue dress, how she'd trusted Papa to protect her until the moment he'd handed her over like collateral in a deal with devils. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't always about healing the person who'd caused the wound. Sometimes it was about honoring the child who deserved better than what she'd received. Sometimes it was about refusing to pretend that love could exist without protection, or that regret could undo choices that had carved permanent scars into a daughter's soul. Papa had taught me that survival sometimes required cutting away the people who'd hurt you, even when they shared your blood. I picked up the phone and called Clara back, my fingers steady for the first time since her first call. "Tell him I'm sorry he's suffering," I said quietly, each word chosen with the precision I'd learned in boardrooms where weakness could cost millions. "But I won't be coming." The silence on the other end stretched long enough for me to hear my own heartbeat, to remember the sound of money being counted on our kitchen table, to recall the weight of shame that had once threatened to drown me. Finally, Clara whispered that she understood, and that she'd always admired my strength even when she couldn't match it herself. After I hung up, I walked onto my balcony and watched the sun set behind buildings I owned, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that reminded me of better endings. Papa had been right about one thing. I had become successful beyond anything our family had ever imagined. But my success wasn't built on his foundation. It was built despite his betrayal, on ground Harold had helped me claim for myself. Some people deserved forgiveness, and some people deserve the consequences of their choices. Tonight, I'll sleep peacefully in the safety I've created, knowing that the scared 16-year-old girl I used to be finally has someone who'll protect her completely, someone who will never let her be sold again, never let her wear another dead woman's dress, never let her disappear inside her own skin, even if that someone is the woman she grew up to become.